Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 181. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by QPR sports scientists Ross Bennett and Ciaran Deely. How are we, lads?
Yeah, all good, Ben. Thanks for the invite. And yeah, I was on it, I think 4 years ago, so it's good to come back and renew stuff. So thanks for having us on.
Hi, Ben. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for having us on. My first time, so looking forward to it.
Awesome, lads. I really appreciate the time and coming on. And Ross, I can't believe, has it actually been 4 years? That's mental.
Yeah, it was before I had my boy. He was coming up to 4 in July. I remember it in the old house. I was upstairs walking around with the AirPods on, same AirPods. So yeah, I remember that.
Don't say that, because Apple will be acting on that, trying to get you to buy new ones.
Of course, yeah, 100%.
Class. Well, thank you very much, lads. I really appreciate it. Well, let's just jump into it. Ross, we did this in your previous episode, but I want to go through some background and also some recent updates in terms of how your roles might have changed recently as well. So let's start with you, mate. Just give us a little bit of background on yourself and then also a little bit more specifics on your current role at the club.
Yeah, sure, Ben. Like, I won't go too extensive because I know we've been on before, but I'll give you a whistle-stop tour, hopefully. Started originally from a playing perspective. So as a youth player, I played at Millwall and then Brentford, which was a local academy to me in southwest London. I went up to them until the end of under 18. So I did, or end of under 17s. I did an extended schoolboy, which back then was called a non-contract agreement, where you did your education elsewhere, because I quite liked my education where I was, and I wanted to carry on with A-levels, and it wasn't really a known thing back in the day. But yeah, I got to the end of under 17 and unfortunately didn't get offered a next contract. So I kind of steered down the educational route, finished off my A-levels, went to St Mary's to do a undergrad in S&C. It was the second year that they'd done that at St Mary's there. So it was very in its infancy. It was a brilliant course. And we'll come on to a couple of key people I met at St Mary's later on, I'm sure. But then I did a postgrad at Brunel in sports science. I wanted to kind of diversify my knowledge and get a little bit more understanding around the applied sports science in biomechanics, physiology. So I did a master's down the road at the rival university, which didn't go down too well. But at the meantime, I was very fortunate in my second year at St Mary's to get an internship at Chelsea Football Club, where I went and worked in with the foundation phase to start with, and just doing some basic movement skills and fun games and FMS type work, and just working with the real kids as they started to really drive their sports science provision and athletic development provision at that time period in 2013. Managed to then get a part-time job there. So very, very delighted to go and work and see the top end of football academies at the time. And my first job, I remember it, I was working with the under 14s, my first paid job. And I was assisting a guy called Michael Bill with the under 14s at Chelsea. And we had people like Mason Mount, Declan Rice, Tammy Abraham, all 13 years of age, Fikayo Tomori. Well, I could Reece James, reel off about 10 or 12 players that are now playing in the Premier League, who in my first paid role was excellent for me, because not only was I learning my craft in sports science and athletic development, I was learning off arguably one of the best coaches in the country now, Michael Bill, and I was being pushed by some of the best players we've got today in an England shirt. So they was just driving me to be better and better. I stayed at Chelsea for just over 5 years, coming up to 6 years. And I worked across 9s to 16s really in more of a part-time capacity. And then I went to Qatar to work with the national team over there, the 2000s. So it would have been under 14s at the time, as they're kind of building towards this World Cup that's coming up very soon. So I was there for a very short period of time, more family reasons, and my wife struggled to relocate and settle. So we came home a bit sooner than planned. But I managed to land a job at QPR, where I've now been for 8 years. Came in at QPR as the YDP sports scientist, quite quickly moved to the under 23s, and then became head of sports science, and now head of academy performance, where I oversee all of the sports science, S&C provision, psychology, nutrition, performance analysis, which has come under my remit in the last 2 years. And very recently just added a little additional role as an academy coach, where I'm now coaching the under 16s from a technical perspective as well. So very, very busy, thoroughly enjoying my time here. We've got lots of projects going on. Obviously, it's where I met Ciaran, who's on the podcast today, and had a spell with him at London GA while he was the manager there. So yeah, lots I've done in the last 13, 14 years in terms of career. But yeah, very, very happy where I am, and keep progressing here and adding on little roles.
Perfect, mate. We're going to get into some of that in a second as well. But Ciaran, do you want to give us a little bit of rundown on yourself, mate, as well?
Yeah, so mine was probably a little bit, I went around the houses a little bit more than Ross in terms of the different sports. So I grew up in the countryside in Ireland, and then my two main sports were Gaelic football, which is the national sport in Ireland, or the most popular sport, definitely, and then football as well. And got to the age of 18 and had to decide one or the other. Decided on Gaelic football because there was kind of more opportunity there to play in big games and stadiums and stuff if you didn't make it across the water into the Premier League or Championship. So I had a very enjoyable Gaelic football career in Ireland. It's unpaid amateur ethos sport, but managed to play for my county and captain it and play on the national level, let's say, in the big stadiums and stuff like that. So very, very, very enjoyable time with Wexford GA, they were called. During that time, then I did a degree in exercise and sports science in University of Limerick, moved to Dublin after that and worked really as a full-time coach in Gaelic football, which really was a really good experience for me because you were coaching little kids from the age of, 4 and 5 all the way up to 18-year-olds about the skills of Gaelic football, and you were out in the schools, in the clubs, and it gave me a great kind of grounding in pedagogy and how kids and how people can learn skills and improve at sport. So I'd always recommend people to get out and coach at a young age as possible, and with kids rather than just kind of at the adult level. After that, then I suppose my career in sports science was always limited by being located in Ireland and playing my Gaelic football career. So afterwards, at the age of just before 30, I came over to London, did a master's in strength and conditioning in Middlesex University under Anthony Turner, and then started an internship with QPR, got in as got a full-time position, sports scientist. And I suppose over the last kind of 9 years, I suppose, I've been in and out of QPR Academy. Took a little bit of a sabbatical to go to India to work with Kerala Blasters for a season in the Indian Super League, which was a bizarre and amazing and crazy experience. All the madness that you'd expect from living there and everything, it definitely was the case. But yeah, picked up a lot of kind of different life skills and dealing with first team coaches and stuff like that, was interesting, challenging, but interesting. And then after I came back, I managed, as Ross briefly said, in a kind of a part-time role with expenses, I managed the London Gaelic football team, senior football team, which we did participate in the Irish League. So we would fly over and back to Ireland, and teams would come over to London to play in the national leagues. And that was again massive experience, being the manager, being the head coach, having, I suppose there were probably about 14 volunteer staff and part-time staff under you, and just kind of navigating the waters and driving the ship in a certain direction. You pick up a lot of skills from that. Did that for 4 or 5 seasons. And just recently then have a couple of different roles, really. I'm working as a sports scientist in QPR Academy, doing a PhD now. I'm 2 years into my PhD as a collaboration with Northumbria University and Queen's Park Rangers Academy, which has been going great, even though very, very challenging. And the third thing then is I run my business, DeelySportsScience.com, as an aside. So that's kind of advising coaches, mostly Irish, mostly Gaelic football, but with football and rugby and hurling and different sports as well. Just a completely online kind of service that we run. So we produce a lot of content and get a lot of good discussions and do a little podcast, myself and Ross, the Locker Room podcast on the side. So it's been a whirlwind, but good fun.
How have you found the podcasting world?
Very interesting. As I say, good fun and challenging at times. Doing a little bit of homework on your different guests, coming up with different topics. It's been good because we cover a number of different sports. As I said, the Gaelic sports and football, but also we'll, obviously dip into the sports science and the S&C and everything as well. There's a number of us, so I know for yourself or Pacey Performance, another guy, our sportsmate and stuff, doing a podcast every week or every 2 weeks or whatever I'm sure it's a massive challenge. So we try and kind of divvy up a little bit, a few different presenters and different topics, and we do it once a fortnight. So yeah, it's been interesting. The multimedia kind of world has been another little string to our bow and learning about it.
Awesome. Can you give us a little bit of an overview on the research that you're doing? Because I think it'd be great to sort of take us into a few different topics.
Yeah, so as I said, it's a collaborative doctoral training scheme. So I think originally Ross came to me with the idea doing it with Dr. Jamie Tallant, who was at St. Mary's University at the time. That kind of fell through. So then all of a sudden, Ross, I'm not sure how exactly we ended up doing it, but Professor Glyn Howitson from Northumbria University in Newcastle came on board. So as I say, it's slightly different. I mean, it's becoming popular now, these PhD programs whereby you have practitioners embedded into a club or into an organization. So, you see different clubs like Man United have done it. Liverpool have definitely done it over the last number of years. Arsenal have. Not many clubs at category 2 at our level. So we kind of like to think, a little bit of trailblazers in that sense. Some of the EIS sports as well do it. So I'm embedded in QPR. I work here 3 days a week. Another at least 2 days a week, then I'm completing my PhD. Like the rules are not hard and fast. So in terms of in those 3 days in QPR, I will be obviously touching on aspects of my PhD. In the 2 days I'm working from at home, I'll be doing bits of QPR work when it needs to be. So it's quite flexible and fluid in that case. It's a full-time program, so you're supposed to complete it within 3 years. Definitely within 4 years is the idea. So rather than like a part-time basis, you're completed anything between like 5 to 7 years. And I think Dr. Robin Thorpe and some of the other guys who've done it with Man United and Liverpool, I believe, do it on a part-time basis, and they're embedded into the club as well. Like there are good things and challenges about being doing it alongside a club. So for instance, for somebody like me, because I knew the coaches, I knew Ross, I knew the sports science department, the players, there was no kind of integration into the setup that I was in there anyway. So it meant that we could have conversations with the coaches and say, listen, we need to push training back a little later this morning because we're completing testing before training. Could we make sure that there's fresh as possible coming into the session? This session we need as high intensity as possible, or recovery session. So it just meant that those relationships were already there and were already built. So that was definitely helpful. On the flip side, obviously, I've got to know a lot of PhD researchers in different universities. The people who are full-time in the universities are probably exposed more to the academic side of the PhD program. So that's something that when you're in the club is missing a little bit, whereby you don't have like 4 or 5 PhD researchers chatting over lunch and talking about their study and the research and the stats and stuff like that. So, there are good and bad, but just overall with the program we were kind of, I suppose we implemented a really comprehensive monitoring program especially of the under 18 players here over the last, 8 years that both of us have been here. And it just meant that we were interested in looking at, okay, these tests that we're carrying out, the questionnaires, the perceptual measures of fatigue and readiness to train, the counter movement jumps, the drop jumps, tests like this, the Brums questionnaire, also are they valid measures? Are they reliable? Do they, correlate to kind of more laboratory gold standard measures of fatigue? And so we decided then, in collaboration with the lecturers, with Professor Howitson and Dr. Kevin Thomas and Dr. Stuart Goodall and Dr. Jamie Tallant, then to kind of focus mostly on neuromuscular function, neuromuscular fatigue or neuromuscular function. And also then the perceived measures of fatigue alongside that, and the physical measures such as the counter movement jump and RSI, as I mentioned. So we're doing a number of different studies. We've got one study that's fully completed and just about ready to be submitted for review, I hope this week, after a kind of a long journey getting it to that level. So that one was quite an interesting study where we wanted to see response from our profile, basically neuromuscular function and the other measures of fatigue across a training week in the under 18 elite youth players, let's say. So we tested them beforehand when they were in a fresh state on a Tuesday morning. We did a really high intensity session then on Tuesday, followed by a strength session. We tested them immediately afterwards to see the acute responses of a strenuous training day. And then we tested them then 24-hour, 48-hour, 72-hour post to kind of see that response over the training week. We also then trained a moderate session on the Thursday. So it meant that not only were we looking at the acute effects of that really high intensity day, we're also looking at the cumulative effects of 2 training days and 2 strength sessions. And just seeing what is the response, what's the profile of these players, what's the profile of the neuromuscular function and perceptual responses, and also then to see, well, do any of these other kind of simple in the field tests, such as the questionnaires and the brums and the jumps, are they good, a valid kind of surrogate measure of neuromuscular fatigue? So yeah, we've found some interesting findings, and we're kind of pushing on into the rest of the studies. Some of them that we've just completed a reliability study. We're in the middle of completing a seasonal variation. So how do these responses differ across a season? So from early to mid to late season, do the responses change over that period? And again, we're trying to, not only are we trying to kind of educate ourselves and give information for our own academy, we think that the findings that we'll get from these and the conclusions that other clubs, other academies can kind of apply them into their setups as well.
Yeah, brilliant. And Ross, have you got anything to add on that in terms of how that may inform practice going forward?
Yeah, of course. You can tell why I wanted Ciaran to come on and explain it, Ben, into the detail. And he's gone fairly superficial on us as well. It's very good stuff. I mean, we're the first academy to ever stim players. So the test that we do, kids, you might explain a bit more on the technique a bit later, but it's very innovative. And I think that monitoring fatigue, and I know it's something that we'll come on to speak about, is something that's not done very well, I don't think, in general in football. I think we're a bit scared to do stuff with players when they come in the morning, especially when they become in the first team. And I think if you had to pick between monitoring the responsive training or actually monitoring the training load, I think the response is arguably more important than monitoring the training load. Yet actually we focus so much on GPS and internal measures of heart rate and stuff like that. But how do you know how your players are responding, and how do you know that we could push them more or actually come off them a little bit? So I think it's going to inform, number one, the thing was that we want to validate the stuff that we do, and do we need to make tweaks to our monitoring process? That's really pivotal. And then number two is, well, is there something going on with our different types of players that make them respond differently? We've got hypothesis that, the more aerobic type players and the stronger type players are responding better, but are they responding better to certain type of stimuli? And are there certain tests that are going to pick that up? So it was really good to I think, in the next 3 years to validate, as Ciaran said, what we're doing, but to be able to give that to the wider community and try and give simple tests that are easy to do with minimal equipment, aren't expensive, and to be able to do it very well and thoroughly, and go into the coaches meeting in the morning to say, this player is good to go, this player's okay, he's a little bit down, but it's nothing to worry about, but actually last 3 days this player he could be at risk. You can never say that he's going to get injured. You can just say he could be at risk of something happening. We feel like there's something going on. So what are we going to do with that individual? Are we going to monitor him? Are we going to modify him? These are the sort of questions you should be having on a daily basis, in my opinion. So I'm really glad we managed to pull Ciaran around to do it. He was the best man for the job in terms of his experiences and his academic understanding and knowledge. And I think he's gonna blow up the world football community, not just here at QPR.
Thanks, Ross. I suppose the novel aspect of it is that once you start delving into the research, you find that not much research is actually done on academy football players. So let's call it elite or professional academy football players. There's a little bit done on Premier League, but more about kind of training load and, non-invasive measures like that. And obviously then there's always lots of studies done on white male 21-year-old university level semi-pro amateur athletes. So I think the thing that the lecturers involved with us, the supervisory team, are most excited about actually is that we're getting to do with actually academy players and professional academy players. Just some of the techniques that Ross has been just very, very briefly, like something that hasn't been done before. There's been some testing done in Hibernia Football Club, also in Blackburn as well, and a couple of others. But in terms of what we can see, we're the first club to do electrical stimulation of the femoral nerve. So we get the players into a movable chair, lock them into it. They do a MVC, maximum voluntary contraction of the knee extensor. We hook up then the electrical stimulation just to on the femoral triangle, and basically what we do is we ask them to kick out as hard as possible isometrically. We find the peak force then that they've produced, but also then we stimulate, we superimpose electrical stimulation and look at the twitch response on top of that maximum voluntary contraction. So that can then identify whether the muscle is absolutely maxed out voluntarily, or that there's a little bit extra there, and we can identify central nervous system fatigue from that, and also then potentiated twitch. So it's another electrical stimulation 2 or 3 seconds after the contraction, and from that then we can see changes in contractile function of the muscle. So in other words, we can largely identify then, is there damage actually in the muscle, in the muscle fibers and the ability for the muscle to contract maximally, or is it coming more from your CNS, your central nervous system? And that's quite important because, just thinking of recovery modalities and stuff like that, and also the type of training that we need to put those players through. So that's quite novel for us to do. And then to be able to do it right across the training week, even on their day off on a Wednesday, we're still getting them in and doing the testing, and then also to do it across the season as well at different time points. So we're quite hopeful that, we're finding some interesting findings. And like one of the best thing for us is that we did find significant changes and significant responses from the questionnaires. So we ran a number of different questionnaires. So some questionnaires are better than others, what we found. And also, we found actually that the contractile function, so you'd call it, peripheral fatigue, if you want to call it that, even though now we are beginning to think of fatigue as a symptom of tiredness and weakness, that's still there 72 hours after the initial strenuous training session. So for instance, you're doing your conditioning session on a Tuesday morning, like most clubs are. We found actually that those players were still significantly down on a Friday morning then going into the training session. Unfortunately, we didn't get to test them on a Saturday morning to see how they, come to the competitive game, but it still is important. It just shows that the cumulative effect of the whole academy program is having a major effect on these young players. And you just need to make sure you get them recovery modalities or, pitch your training, like Ross is saying, correct kind of preparation for that.
So there's a bit of an overview statement on that. It'll just hopefully give a little bit more clarity on when to push and when to pull sort of thing, when to give players that little bit extra in terms of recovery, and when also that we can go a bit more intense with players.
Yeah, so I suppose exactly that. What we found is that immediately post and all the way to 72 hours afterwards, there's still damage there in those muscle fibers, and that's amongst under 18 academy players. They're not yet recovered back to baselines. The other thing is that perceptually the players feel that they're recovered by 48 hours. So they feel by that Thursday morning that they're actually recovered. And what we're identifying is actually that they're not. There's still damage in that muscle. Now, whether it can be down to a host of factors that they don't feel that they're not still feeling that they're fatigued and tired. It may be that they want to kind of show that they're ready. They don't want to tell the truth. We don't know about that, but we've done the perceptual measures for 8 years at this stage. We feel like we've got good questionnaires. We they tell the truth, so we feel that they're quite reliable. So yeah, it just shows that, you know, you need to be careful with the training load that you're giving these players. The other thing as well is that it does mean that these players need to be highly physically robust and resistant to fatigue, that, you know, doing a number of conditioning sessions on a Tuesday match day -4 might be beneficial and might kind of attenuate muscle damage in these players. So it's, yeah, quite interesting. A few other little small things, Ben, as well, that we also measured adductor squeeze scores. We looked at BRUMS, so profile of mood, questionnaire as well. And actually we found no changes, significant changes whatsoever in either of those tests. So, you know, we carried them out on the exact same days as well after that strenuous session right throughout the week. And the group mean would say that actually there were no changes in those measures. So a lot of clubs are obviously carrying out adductor squeezes and looking at the scores, and also some are carrying out BRUMS. I'm not sure how many, but actually we found no significant effect from those.
No, it's interesting. I was going to get a bit of a seamless link into you now, Ras, because I want to get into the sort of changes in your role. But just to sort of piggyback on the back of what Ciaran's been talking about there with that research and taking it more into the technical side, and how we maybe influence training and the approach that we take with players. If only we had a technical coach on as well, like it just So can you give a little bit of a breakdown on that in terms of, obviously there's more stuff to come off the back of what Ciaran's working on, but at the moment, what that looks like in terms of how that may influence the week for you?
Of course. Well, I think for me is a couple of things. Like, it's all contextual to our club. So the way that we train the Tuesday, we have Wednesday off because of education, and we train Thursday again. Now, the additional session on the Thursday, it could be that is having quite a big effect on them not recovering by the Friday. So the Thursday session in our context isn't a light session, it's a moderate session. It's definitely lighter than the Tuesday, but my questions are the Thursday session slightly too hard to allow them to recover for the Saturday? And then the other flip side is it's a development process, and actually, do we want them fully recovered for the game on the weekend? So you've got all these contextual things to think about, because we're not fussed about the 3 points at the weekend. We're fussed about their long-term plan and ultimately getting them into the first team. So all these things are to throw into the mix and come off the back of it. But I think it's really important that this sort of info is fed back to all of the coaches, and I think it's fair to Ciaran to say that the club have been excellent in the support of the PhD. Our technical director, Chris Ramsey, Alex Carroll, Academy Director, have backed all the funding for it, to half with Northumbria Uni, of course, and they're really interested in the results and how it might impact how we train the players. We're very integrative here, so everything's very football based, but they want a lot of info from sports science to help the practices. We have stock practices. When's the right time to use certain practices? If we're looking at certain themes, how's that going to impact the response to players? If we're doing counter-attacking, there's going to be a lot of high-speed running, is going to be extensive. So how does that impact what each individual response is? And we're just looking at each individual, their development over time and their response to each training bout, and what's, as you said, what's the best time to push, what's the best time to pull.
I think as well, Ben, just as regards piggybacking on that, about, for instance, tests like the adductor squeeze or like the BRUMS or the counter movement jump, we found some significance. So 24-hour post, we did see a change, but then we didn't see any response after that. But the important thing to think about as well is that, you know, every club, and certainly here, it's all about the individual development plan or the individual action plan for that, or learning plan for that player. And even though it's easy to dismiss tests that don't show a response to training or to high intensity training, like the BRUMS and some of those that I mentioned, there may be some interesting findings to find on an individual level. So for instance, on a questionnaire, we found some interesting findings when you ask a player, are you fatigued? Are your muscles sore? Are you ready to train? We found nothing if you asked them, how is your sleep? How's your motivation? How are your stress levels? But does that mean that you take out that question about sleep then? Because maybe that might identify one or two players who actually might respond and tell you, you know, that they didn't sleep well. And that's quite important for you to know as a practitioner then, that those two individuals. So like in the research, we're always looking at the group mean, but at times you can obviously miss out on individual players. And we don't have a sample size large enough to kind of, absolutely confidently predict that in every club, these results will adhere to their setup. We're working with a sample size of about 16 players or something like that. So I think it's quite important that every club take the test them themselves, and have a look at the reliability, the validity, and then you're seeing that, okay, it might actually be applicable to my players. Like a ductor squeeze, I could easily think of a couple of players last year who had localized, weaknesses in the adductors. So actually that test was quite good for those particular players, even though it may not be applicable then to the squad as a whole. So they're the kind of things that, coming into the morning meeting that you need to be able to feed back into the coaches. And as Ross says, we hope that these are the type of findings that maybe you're able to say to coach, okay, on a Thursday morning, I think the players are still fatigued and affected from the Tuesday morning, but it might be the case that you're looking at the developmental process and you're saying, well, actually, let's not worry about the game on the weekend and let's keep pushing them and, physically developing them and looking at the tactical and the technical, which I think from QPR's side, Ross, is probably our main focus anyway, like lots of clubs.
Yeah, sure, Ben. I think you hit the nail on the head. I was going to say, like, those with different injury histories are going to have different profiles and different types of screening. So we spoke to Robin Thorpe, and he came and did some stuff with us and some of the great work they was doing there, and they set up their monitoring processes. So I think it's really important to really think about the individual. What screening is going to identify certain weaknesses for them, what are going to be red flags, and then you might have your global measures that like can predict fatigue in inverted commas, whatever level, peripheral, central, your objective, subjective measures, to go from there.
No, really interesting, lads. It'll be great to see how things develop as well. So we'll have to get another one in a maybe a few months' time to see where we're up to with it. But Ross, just as well on your roles, I'm interested to discuss the sort of changes and development that's happened in your role at the club. Because including more technical work and obviously now leading, or I'm guessing, are you leading the squad now, the 16s, did you say?
So I work with a guy called Liban Mood. I give a shout out. We work quite close together. So, but he's also the assistant coach for the 18s. So I'm headed up the performance side and working on the sports science side for the 18s and other clubs, age groups. But then I coach with him in the evening. So we work. I spend more time with him than I do my wife all the time. So it's very busy, Ben. I've took on more responsibility from a managerial perspective as well. As I said, performance analysis now come under my remit, which is brilliant. I think that understanding of the game helps me link the sports science to the analyst and what they're looking for and how to support the coaches. But yeah, so 3 evenings a week, I'm coaching the 16s with Liban and taking them on the weekend as well on the Saturday for games. We've had the same group now for 2 years, so 15s and 16s, and I think we've just signed 9 new scholars, which was brilliant to take 9 scholars through to next year, who we think has got a couple of players in there that could, ultimately long term get into our first team or have a career in the game. So yeah, I'm very busy. I'm here all the time at the minute, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I love what I do, and I think the balance of the two things is brilliant for me right now.
And with the understanding of the sort of technical and tactical side, like we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, where do you sit in terms of sports scientists, S&C coaches? Like, how much understanding do we need of that side of the game, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because, those that follow me on Twitter will see me tweet stuff and have little debates back and forth. And I think I've calmed down the last year or so, but I'm still partial to a couple of controversial tweets. But I think that for me, I think it's really important that you understand the game. I don't think the sports scientist has to be a coach to a level that can put on a coaching session. But I think if you don't understand the context of the game, I think you're looking at it from a completely different lens that might change your perspective on things. So, for example, if you want an extensive session in a session and you're driving the coaches, we need to hit X amount of numbers, and we have those here as well. We have targets for days of the week where we want to try and hit certain percentage of match load or whatever it is in certain metrics. But the coaches focus on that particular week because the group need it is something like breaking lines in quarter 4. So we have we put the pitches into 4 quarters. So instead of thirds, thirds, into quarters, essentially. So say you're working in quarter 4 about breaking lines and combination play to create goal scoring opportunities when they're set up in a good shape. Like, that session isn't going to elicit lots of high speed running or extensive numbers that you want it, but actually what's best for the players at that moment in time is that development session. Like, that's what they need for their development session to be a footballer, because it's so ingrained in the skill side of it, and the physical so ingrained in the skill of the sport. So in that situation, I think there's no other option. If you want the extensive, then you just do some isolated extensive running, or maybe at the end of training, or you do your max speed stuff at the start. So that's where I think that you have to have the context, so that you everything can't be football based, because if you just put football practice on to get the physical numbers, you're missing out on the learning and the flow of the session. You might just do a 1v1 drill from the halfway line just for the sake of doing a 1v1 drill, so that you can call it football, but actually it's not football, because you're doing it for a physical perspective. What's the flow of the session? How have you scaffolded the session? What's the coach thinking in terms of the outcomes? Then you can work your physical stuff around that, to supplement it. Hopefully the themes fit. Like I said, the counter-attacking theme is perfect for high-speed running, but then how do you manage that on a Thursday or Friday when the coaches want to still revisit some transitional stuff and counter-attacking over larger areas, but you don't necessarily want those high-speed runners? So I think if you don't know these contexts and these understanding of the game, I just don't see how you could do your job to the best level. And things like that. I think as well, you need to understand the job roles of each player. So what is the movements that each player is going to have to go through? What are the technical requirements when you're looking at individual work, you're looking at rehab? Like, I see rehab sessions like across the country, which are very generic, and you see a lot of, I call them obstacle course type stuff, where you've got different physical movements, which is fine in the early stages, but how are you going to prep them then to go back into the session where they're going to have to receive the ball on the half turn, play a various amount of passes, get to a player and press and stop the turn, things like that. I think you should be drip feeding this information in during the rehab process, so that when they go back into the session, it's not complete overload, or they haven't gone backwards from a learning perspective. So I think them sort of things are really important, to make sure that the language, the philosophy, how you interact with the coaches, you understand the context of what they're trying to achieve. I think you get a little bit more buy-in, but by all means, I don't think you need to be a coach. I just think you need to understand the sport and the philosophy that you're driving it at the club.
Have you got anything on that, Ciaran? What's your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, Ross covered it really, really well there. I mean, it's interesting. We've kind of both done, in the last 10 years, we've both been sports scientists, we've both been coaches, and we both kind of manage different departments or teams, and, the same skills are kind of required that come up all the time. I think, just to put it simply, and to add to what Ross said, is just the terminology, the language, the interactions with the coaches is so much easier when you can speak their language, when you can talk the language of football or any other sport, that you have experience of a coach. And I think as well, you can give better advice in terms of how to set up practices, or how to do, late stage rehab and stuff like that. But also, I think your greater understanding of the sport, you give greater advice as well in terms of the loading to the coaches. And I think they can, respect your opinion and everything like that. You're a long way away from the kind of sports scientist, just with the iPad and shouting out numbers and timings and stuff like that. That you can actually be beside the coach and chatting and devising sessions together. It's quite interesting, actually, because Ross is the under-16s coach, as he says, and I've been in sessions then where I've been the sports scientist for that group, and all Ross's best practice sports science concepts and all go out the window then when he takes over the sessions. So.
Brilliant. Ross, you mentioned before about I think you call them controversial. I don't think they're controversial tweets. I think it's good to have some discussions, and I'm going to bring one up, and we'll expand on it a little bit. So when was this from? This was from February, 23rd of Feb. The more I discuss and think about absolute high-speed running zones, the more I think it's wrong. The only arguments are it assesses performance and we can compare to everyone else. The set speed, 5.5 for most players, is too low to assess true high-speed running, and it's biased to their speed / aerobic profile. With a lot of people getting into some good discussions and a lot of people agreeing as well. So do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the reason why I say controversial is that a tweet like that, for example, that's because the majority of people are actually doing that. So the majority of people are setting their threshold as absolute HSR. I think like a couple of points on that. As I said there, for me, you've got to come back to the question, what do you want from your high speed running numbers? We internally, we'll talk about what we use in terms of relative zones, but it's got to be a threshold set that identifies some sort of harder running, if you want to put it in simple terms. If you want to try to look towards more anaerobic running, then you can try to decipher a set speed and a zone, which is very hard, and we'll come on to that. But I just think that 5.5A is too low. If you look at most professional players up and around 9 to 10, it's going to be looking at like 55, 60, 62% top whack of your max speed. And I think you've got to look at the question of what is it you want to measure. And I think also the bias is that if you've got a player who can run 10.6 meters per second, then they've only got to go, 50% or just over 50% to get that high speed running number. So if you're telling a coach from a performance perspective, this player is hitting high speed running all the time. Look, he's got 1200 meters of high speed running, but the player whose max speed is 8.5 meters per second's only got 200 meters. Well, for me, that's a no-brainer. Of course, he has to run at the person at 8 point something meters per second has to run at such a higher percentage of his max speed to get it, that I think you're unfairly biased in, putting unfair bias towards the quicker player. Like, we can tell the coach that player's the quickest player in the group, so there's the performance thing checked off for us. We want to try and develop other players and his speed even more. So I just think we have to be careful about what we're trying to measure, and also then from a monitoring perspective, if we want to look at, it's all about leveling the playing field for us. So we want to look at what point are our players going through stress, and how much accumulation of that stress have they been going through. So if we're not leveling the playing field with just an absolute number, then for me, the numbers are irrelevant. You can't really tell how hard a player's working, especially when you're looking at development blocks. You're going from 16 to 18 to 23 to the first team. Of course, there's going to be a linear increase in HSR because they get more mature, they get more powerful, they get quicker. So it's easier to hit that number. So these are all the things that I think, why are we still using absolute? Yet for some reason, we like to compare across club to club, and we like to compare across lots of historical data that we've got 10 years of. But for me, it's wrong. It's not correct data. So, that's why we've been using relative zones ever since I've been at the club and come into the department. And, it's where I utilize Ciaran for his expertise and his sports science expertise. And I think we've come up with some really strong, relative zones that are different to everybody else, but probably the most accurate, I would say.
Ciaran, can you expand on that in terms of those zones?
Yeah, so just briefly first about the absolute. I mean, there is a problem there because an awful lot of the research will work off the 5.5 and the 7 meters per second, and it's an arbitrary number number that somebody has come up with at some stage. And I mean, the 5.5 was originally, when we started this, nearly 10 years ago, Ross, that was what Stat Sports had their high speed running and their zone 6 or speed, sprint distance set at. Now, I don't know who advised them to do that, or, we get on well with boys in Stat Sports. I'm not going to give out too much about them, but who knows where that came up with originally. So it was, as Ross said, about probably 8 years ago or so, we started working off high speed running was set at 67% of maximum speed, and that was actually taken from Martin Boucher. And Ross, you spoke to Martin, less than a year ago, just his kind of rationale about that, and he had done some laboratory testing and found that 67% was kind of as close as possible to a kind of a threshold from his laboratory tests. We've kind of taken it on then in the last less than a year, I suppose, where we're taking our mass test and we're looking at our maximum sprint speed as well. We're working out our anaerobic speed reserve from that. Gareth Stanford and some of the lads have done a lot of work in that, and also Martin Boucher. And then what we've done then is we've taken percentages of that aerobic speed reserve. So we're looking at 30% of anaerobic speed reserve added on to their mass score for high speed running, and then 60% of anaerobic speed reserve added to their mass score for very high speed running. Ross, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're working in the day-to-day dealings across the squad with that.
Yeah, no, that's correct. I mean, we worked at percentages of max speed for a long time. I was very fortunate enough to work with Martin Boucher in Qatar when I was there at Aspire, and he's someone that me and Ciaran religiously look at his work. I think he's excellent, the stuff that they're doing, and he's done over the years. But essentially, the max speed, we found a bit of a problem with it, because if your max speed is fairly low and your aerobic capacity is quite high, you can hit the high percentages of max speed quite easily. Whereas if your max speed's really high and your aerobic capacity is lower, like some of our profiling of centre forwards or maybe some explosive wingers, then again they might be underreporting their HSR. So we've now gone into the point where we're looking at aerobic profiling, from the mass score, and also the anaerobic speed reserve, which hopefully takes that bias away and levels the playing field for all players, really. So we're not saying it's perfect, and we've kind of come up with these numbers based on what we think is appropriate. It would be good, I think, if people start, trying to experiment a bit more and trying to level the playing field across the board. Hopefully we get to a point where it's the same for everybody. And I know Ciaran says they use it a lot in the research, but we could use those numbers in the research for 5.5, and we still collect that data for that purpose. But I think in the clubs, we have to give a bit more insightful data and be a bit fairer to our athletes and our players that we're working with day to day.
It does make logical sense that we now are using, we're working out our zones and our thresholds based off two physiological markers. So their maximum aerobic speed and also their maximum sprint speed. So you would expect that that's going to be a more valid measure than just working off one, where, as Ross is saying, your HSR can be either under or over reported. So yeah, we're finding some good results. We've implemented also in the last year. We've been quite busy in the last year. We've implemented a new kind of dashboard right across the academy as well, where we've moved from using our Excel and everything like that on to using our Power BI as well. So we're getting some really nice insights across each squad and all the different variables as well. We're gathering a lot of variables, but then focusing on just the kind of 6 or so main variables, like the usual ones of distance and very high speed running, high speed, accel, decel, sprint distance, percentage, max speed. But we just have a way of implementing our targets on that. The visualizations are nice, and I do see a lot of people at different times on social media give out about visualizations, but I think you need to look beyond that and just see that it's a tool, it's an aid to kind of educate the coaches and present data in a nice kind of seamless manner that they can understand. And using your traffic light data of the green, amber, reds and everything like that on those visualizations, on your tables and charts and stuff can kind of aid understanding. Then again, trying to affect training as much as possible and the overall the whole program.
I feel like this podcast come at a really nice time, because actually the previous episode was with Gareth Sanford and Damien Harper, and they spoke about a lot of stuff that sort of crosses over what you guys have spoken about. So I think it's been really nice. Anyone that's not listened to that episode, go back and listen to that one as well, because there's some really good stuff that they talked about that links in really nicely with some of the topics we've covered in this one. Lads, I'm just going to move us on, if you don't mind, to some of the quick fire questions we finish each podcast with. And obviously I'll ask you both each question. I always like asking these just to get a little bit more of an insight into you as individuals as well. But to start with, who were some of the biggest influences on your career so far? Ross, I'll put it to you first.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, I've got a few in mind, if you don't mind, just at different stages of the career. I think the first one that really resonates with me is John Goodwin at St Mary's. I was fortunate enough to do a couple of research projects for him, my undergrad and even my postgrad, where I wasn't at St Mary's. I managed to collab with him as well, and we continued some research in there. I just thought the way that he looked at stuff, how analytical he is, and the way that he just took science to a new level was just very thorough, very theoretical, but made sense at the same time. He was an athlete himself, and I've heard him on various podcasts. I know him relatively well. I just think he's top level. So he was one of the biggest ones from an academic perspective. I mentioned Michael Bill at Chelsea, who just taught me the world of what I thought was just top class coaching, who's now at Aston Villa, second at Aston Villa with Stevie G. And no surprise that the teams he's gone to have excelled. I think his understanding, his rapport with players, his individualization, his standards that he set, and how he got that across to young kids without being too harsh, and making sure that, you know, the welfare check and stuff like that was done. I just thought he was top class, and he really set the bar for me in terms of working in football. I always relate things back to him. I spoke a bit about Martin Boucher, who I met very briefly. He was like a hero of mine already. So when I sat next to him in the office, it was just like, oh my God, what's going on here? But I just think he, as a practitioner, as a researcher, understands sport, and again is leading the field. And then the last one for me is Chris Ramsey here at QPR, who's instilled a lot of trust in me. I wouldn't be in the both positions that I'm in now without him personally. And from a coaching perspective, like Michael Beale, I haven't met too many that I'm as impressed with when I see him work on the football pitch. The way he designs practices off the fly now, because he's just so experienced, the way that he can adapt things, the processes that he makes you think about, how adaptable he is, they're second to none. So they're just a few of the people that really stick in my head to get me to where I am right now, I think.
Ciaran, what about yourself?
Yeah, actually, I'll start with a coach as well. So he was my secondary school teacher, but was my college. As you know, I came from a really kind of top GA school back in Ireland, and we were, you know, winning provincials and All Irelands and stuff like that. So Aidan O'Brien was his name, and luckily he became my manager and coach in my club as well. And when I became manager of London GA, I used to speak to him an awful lot, and he's a close friend. So more from a coaching aspect and kind of overall sporting mentor, he has certainly been a huge influence on me. I think more from, I'll have to give him a shout out of Shane Malone in Dublin. So I don't know, do you know Shane? He's a lecturer in Tala IT in Dublin, and he's the guy who comes up with all the Power BI and the visualizations and everything like that I speak of, and also is just a really, really knowledgeable technical sports scientist, I think, and manages to kind of mix that academic side or of stuff with the kind of practical aspect as well. He's been working with Irish rugby sevens in the past and stuff like that as well. And the last one then, I think even just recently in terms of my PhD, I've had obviously Professor Glenn Howatson, who's let's call him a big dog in the academic world. But I've come very, very close to Dr. Jamie Tallant, who's now at University of Essex. And the thing I like about Jamie is he's worked in cricket. He's, you know, consulted with England rugby, with football clubs. He never stops banging on about the Royal Ballet as well. He does some work with them, and he just gives me that kind of grounding in, you know, new areas for me about statistics and how to, you know, structure academic studies and write up papers and stuff like that. So they would certainly be mine, other than my family and wife and everything.
Brilliant. And then Ross, what would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
My biggest strength, good job you told me this before, because I think I would have been caught on the hop if you told me off the back. I've got a couple. I've got one, I think, as a coach. I mean, it's handy because I've gone into the coaching side, but I think as a coach, I bring a lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm. I think I can relate to either kids or adult, you know, senior players, adult players, first team players, whoever you're working with, to be able to drive that session in whatever capacity it is. And I think number two, I have a real critical eye for detail. So the guys will tell you, that those in the department, I'm constantly replying to certain reports they're sending out and saying, are you sure this is correct? Or what about this? Has that been influenced by this? Because I'm just constantly looking for perfection and making sure that everything we send out is just correct. And because the last thing is that you want a coach making the decision of something that either as is correct in number, but maybe the way that it's been perceived has been slightly different, or you haven't considered another certain factor. So I drive them nuts. I'm sure I do drive them crazy with messages and emails. But yeah, I think that the level of detail I try to go into is one of my strengths.
Ciaran?
I suppose the diligence when it comes to like data and you know, the bread and butter of the sports scientist, that you can have all these really interesting stuff to do and out on the pitch and everything like that, but just getting that kind of reliable data, and poor data is poor insight. So you have to make sure everything is correct and everything is right, and then you can give good advice and gain good insights from that data. So I think that's quite an important thing for a sports scientist. And then I suppose in some ways, like Ross, about the coaching, that I have a background in coaching, and just those kind of interpersonal skills and being able to chat to the coaches, I think helps a lot.
Bro. And then final one, lads. What would you say your approach is to like CPD? Obviously, running the podcast and getting to speak to people, I always say that's one of mine. So I'm guessing that's part of it. But in terms of you being busy, especially everything that you got going on, both of you day to day, like what's your approach to CPD?
Yeah, I think it's a really important one. And I think the first thing is to make sure that you're always open. You have an open mindset. So no matter what level you get to, whether you're the top manager in the world, like you should always be open to learning from different people, from different backgrounds, expertise, and coming at stuff from different lenses. So I think that's really important that I try to drum into everyone in our department anyway. But myself, I try and keep myself humble and making sure I'm always looking to learn. I think now there's no better time to be able to learn every day online. You put a podcast on in the car, you make sure that you constantly ticking over. You don't have to go to conferences anymore to take loads of good info away, which is brilliant, because like you say, people are busy and stuff like that. You might have 1 or 2 conferences you target a year for networking, and the big ones, like they say, some of the big conferences. But I think you can constantly, I listen to your show, Pacey Performance. We've got our stuff that we learn loads of from guests, loads of different podcasts that you can listen to. But I think the future of CPD, Ben, is actually having, I do a lot of stuff for bases. So I'm a supervisor for bases, and I've got 5 supervisees that I'm looking after at the minute. And I always say to them, where do you really want to improve? Like, is it a skill set? Is it a knowledge gap? Okay, so if you have those things, then you have to target the CPDs that's really going to develop that. You can't just put something on in the car because it's the last one that came on in the episode. And that's fine for general listening, and you'll learn some stuff. But I think the future is stuff that we go a little bit left field and a bit lateral with. So ideas I've had in my head, if you need to develop a practitioner's or even a player's communication skills, then why not put them on the chef pass down at the local restaurant, where they're going to have to communicate to a team and communicate to waiters and waitresses? Or why not put them in an air control tower where they're seeing people bring flights in every 30 seconds, and it's essential, it's life or death. So I think we've really got to think about, yes, we have our knowledge and our sports science and our football and our coaching, all of those understanding, but how do we develop as people, and where are the gaps? And that's something I would love to bring into our department over time, and really formulate a proper plan to develop them and get them to where they need to be.
Like it. Ciaran, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, mine are quite similar to Ross, and we didn't speak beforehand at all. But in a slightly different manner, I think be very, very targeted in your approach in terms of, and not to go into as much depth as Ross did there, but like, don't just sign up to every single conference and CPD event, because you'll get bored of them and you'll kind of get sick of listening to some of the similar stuff, the content, and maybe even some of the similar speakers. So, identify a number of ones that you really want to go and attend. I think attending a CPD event abroad is a fantastic idea, because it just means that you get that kind of overall experience of being there and networking with people and everything like that. And the other point that I'd make, and in some ways links in with Ross's as well, is that to think, outside the box and a bit differently. I did a leadership course back in Ireland over a year, a couple of years ago at this stage now, as part of kind of former player association in the GA. And it was by far the best CPD I've ever done. And it was just all about the attributes of leadership and how to be a good leader and examples of it. And it meant that I was looking at, we were given content, YouTube content and articles to read that had absolutely nothing to do with sport at all. And where from the military, from business, from, you can learn an awful lot from high performance, these businesses, large corporations. So I think if you can think outside the box a little bit, last little one I'd mention actually as well is use of the outdoors. And, I love my hiking and cycling and stuff like that. And you can learn so much like about yourself and about others, but also about leadership and teamwork and problem solving and troubleshooting from going hiking, going camping and stuff like that. I think it's certainly worthwhile. Ross, there's one, what's the one that a few of the people in the club have done, you know, the really intense one where they're sent then dropped in onto the Brecon Beacons in Wales. And is it at ECAS course?
Yeah, I think it was the ECAS course, and now they're doing it on the EHOC, the Academy Head of Coaching, or something like that. So yeah, they're brilliant stuff. One thing to mention as well, Ben, is to surround yourself with world-class people. So like the thing that I always, and I'm very proud of the department we've got here now. Obviously, Ciaran's in his capacity. We've got Andrew Wiseman, who we've recently employed. Matt Horton, a guy that's been here, works with our B team, who we got from Palace. These sort of people constantly. We had Ben Smalley before. These sort of people constantly challenge you. Bring up good discussions, and I think if you're around like-minded people, you will grow together, and the only people going to benefit are the players. So use your network inside the club as much as you can.
Yeah, I love it. I really like the innovative sort of approach, and anyone that was at our Oxford event, it was a task that we ran. We put up different companies, all sorts of different high-performing teams, from Sainsbury's to Apple we had all different ones up there, and basically got discussions about what can we learn from them and how does it relate to our practice. And then we're talking to sports scientists and S&C coaches, and we were discussing, like I say, Apple and Joe Rogan's podcast and all this crazy stuff, but there's loads of lessons in there, isn't there? So I love that. I think it's really important to sort of open your mind to those things and learn from different places. So I've really enjoyed this, lads. It's been quality, really good. Some great content in there. There's obviously some really exciting stuff going on at the club. We mentioned before we started recording, Ross, there's a new training ground on its way as well. We've not even touched on that. So let's catch up about some updates on the research, on what's happening at the club, and get another one in the books for a few months' time.
Yeah, definitely. If you saw the where we're working at the minute, is to say it's a construction site is an understatement. So we're working on a couple of pitches that are getting worn and torn, and our gym's now in a room that's the size of a classroom. So we're doing our best for the greater good. That's what we're saying.
Brilliant. We really appreciate it, and keep up the good work. Cheers, lads.
Great. Thanks, Ben. And you, mate. Thank you.
Cheers, Ben. Thanks.